So one of the things about draining the swamp, and remember, President Trump promised to drain the swamp. This was one of the main promises that he made on the campaign trail in 2016, that he was going to drain the swamp. And I would say, looking back in hindsight at the 4 years that Trump was in office, he failed to drain the swamp. He did get rid of some swamp creatures, and he certainly deregulated a lot of different sectors and agencies in our country, but he generally failed to drain the swamp completely. And the reason for that is because he underestimated what it was. I think that there was a general understanding of the swamp at the beginning of the Trump administration. And perhaps this was a lot of Republicans as well as administration officials, perhaps even President Trump himself. And their understanding was that there were a few bureaucrats at the top of each of these agencies that needed to be fired, that these political appointees that ran the agencies were the ones who were poisoning the agencies. The FBI is maybe a good example here, that, you'll hear even a lot of Republicans say, you know what? The everyday men and women who serve and sacrifice in the FBI, those people are good. Those people aren't political. It's the James Comeys at the top who are political. It's the Lisa Page and the Peter Strzok's at the top, these political appointees, the executives at the top that pollute it. And this was the generalized understanding of why the bureaucracy in our country and executive agencies was so corrupt. And it turns out that assumption that a lot of people made wasn't correct. And it basically, it can be condensed to President Trump underestimated what the swamp was when he made the promise to drain it. So he failed to drain it because when he made the promise, there was a lack of understanding of exactly what it would take to drain the swamp. So the swamp, of course, and this is just a brief history of what the administrative state is. When I say this phrase, administrative state, and I replace it often, I use them interchangeably with the swamp. What is this? What is the administrative state? Well, the administrative state is composed of government employees and officials in the different agencies in the federal government, and most of whom, the vast majority of whom are not appointed. They don't go through a confirmation hearing. They have no accountability to voters because they're certainly not elected. And it's actually nearly impossible to fire them, yet they have the power to interpret vague legislative words that defer to these agencies on rulemaking. They have the power to interpret these rules, basically imposing their version of their ideology through these rules on us and regulations on us as the people. This is just the very, very simple explanation of what the administrative state is. It's unaccountable employees in executive agencies who we did not vote into power. They're not accountable. They weren't confirmed even by our representatives in Congress, and they can't be fired. Yet they have a ton of power. And they've obviously been known to abuse their power. You can think of I challenge you actually to think of any agency that you can possibly think of. And I challenge you, can you think of abuse from that agency? I can't think of a single agency where there's not examples of abuse. So here's the thing. The administrative state, as it currently stands here in the United States, was not part of the design of our country. It's not part of the Constitution of the United States. So where exactly did it come from? Where did it come from? Because our Constitution was formulated to separate the powers at the federal level, to separate it into the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And this was done deliberately so that we could have a system of checks and balances. And when you have this, it's not even a gray area. When you have this violation of the boundaries of the three powers of executive, legislative, and judicial, when you have the legislative powers deferring some of their legislative authority to the executive branch, these lines become blurred. These boundaries are broken. And in fact, if you want to look at it from a legalistic standpoint, there is a doctrine called the separation of powers doctrine, and there is a legal jurisprudence called the non-delegation theory. The non-delegation theory says each of these branches actually doesn't have the authority to violate the boundaries of their branch. So you're actually not allowed to do that, even if you choose to do it. You can't give away your own power because your power doesn't belong to you. If you are a legislator, it belongs to the people as conferred on you by the Constitution. So there's an argument to be made, which I personally buy into, that says that these people in Congress and these bureaucrats in the executive branch are actually violating our separation of powers doctrine and the non-delegation theory, that they're doing something that is not allowed. I guess regardless of whether they're not allowed or not, it's certainly an unwise thing to do. It's an unwise thing to do, well, for the obvious reasons, because what happens is these bureaucrats who have ideological agendas then interpret rules the way that they want and impose them on the people. So how did we get so off track is a question that we have to ask. How did this come into being? Because we didn't have this administrative state or this violation of separation of powers when our country was first founded. And the answer to that is the people that got us off track, wait for it, you're going to be really surprised by this, progressives. Yes, the left. The left, even back 100 years ago, the left actually got us off track on this. And it started with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, he was the 28th president of the United States. He served from 1913 to 1921. And Woodrow Wilson, it's funny to me that a man like this could even be president because he just fundamentally disagreed with our founding fathers that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of the people. Woodrow Wilson didn't believe that. He believed that government should actually take care of the people. He believed that government should do what his phrase was, do what the times demanded. So he believed in essentially a living constitution. He believed in the government welfare state. And because of this, he was the one who first, I guess, dreamed up this idea of this politically neutral administrative class of workers in our federal government, these federal workers who were a constant, who stayed working in the federal government, administering the executive branch, even through transitions from one president of one party to a president of another party. And to me, that's just ridiculous and absurd that, less than 100 years later, after he assured us that these would be politically neutral people who would just be there for continuity to administer the state, right? The administrative state, that, 95% of political donations from the administrative state are to Democrats, hardly politically neutral. So Woodrow Wilson came up with this idea. He dreamed this up, and it really came to fruition with FDR's New Deal and LBJ's Great Society. These were two presidents who latched on to Woodrow Wilson's ideas and brought it to fruition through government programs, which violated the separation of powers doctrine, which grew this administrative state. And it was during this time that the Supreme Court also stopped enforcing the non-delegation theory, which didn't allow the legislative branch to delegate their power of rulemaking to the executive branch. So all this being said, this is a little brief history of what exactly is it that we're dealing with here. Why was it that President Trump wasn't able to drain the swamp? It wasn't just a matter of a politician making an empty promise and then neglecting to fulfill that promise or to follow through on that promise. It was somewhat of a lack of understanding on his part and on his staff's part and his administration, and a lot of the Republican Party too, I think didn't understand the depth of corruption that existed in the administrative state in the swamp. We thought that it was that playing whack-a-mole essentially would do the trick, that if you identified a bureaucrat that was abusing their power like a Fauci or a Birx, that you could fire them and, okay, that would drain the swamp. That would get rid of these people at the tops of these agencies that, were dribbling down throughout their agencies all these politics. So this is kind of the history of how we got to where we are.